If you're taking on the role of being a director, you've signed up for a big task.
Making sure companies pay for performance is the biggest issue facing compensation committees.
Corporate Board Member presents the Board Governance Series with series contributors PricewaterhouseCoopers and Meridian Compensation Partners. On this edition of the Board Governance Series, revisiting executive employment contracts with Bryan Smith, partner, Meridian Compensation Partners.
Hi, I'm Laura Finn, web editor of boardmember.com. And today I'm speaking with Bryan Smith, partner at Meridian Compensation Partners. Hi, Bryan. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Laura. Thank you.
You're here today to talk about executive employment contracts. And in recent years, it seems that there's been some talk in boardrooms about limiting the use of employment contracts and also some discussion about whether or not contracts are necessary. Do you feel in this day and age that executive employment contracts are necessary for attracting and retaining top talent, or is there a better alternative method?
It's a good observation. We are having a lot of conversations with board members about whether or not contracts do make a whole lot of sense these days. There's a lot of external pressure or scrutiny on certain provisions that are included in contracts. So it is a timely topic, and boards are trying to figure out how they can get away from contracts as well as use other vehicles to get some of the same benefits that contracts provide, but have less constrictions and limitations associated with the contracts.
What issues do you see boards struggling with relative to existing employment contracts?
Well, the biggest issue is that a lot of organizations have contracts that have been in place for several years. So they've been in place for 10 plus years, and market conditions have just evolved over time, and best practices and emerging best practices have shifted. But oftentimes these employment agreements are evergreen in nature, so they're out there and they continue to renew each year, and they've got the same features out there. And now they're highlighting shareholder advocacy groups such as ISS and Glass Lewis that influence proxy voting.
Right.
And larger shareholders actually are having some issues, concerns, and pushing back on some of the features of some of those legacy agreements. So I can give you an example of some of the types of features that are embedded in some of these contracts that boards tend to be struggling with these days.
That would be great.
First one is guaranteed payments. So guaranteed bonuses, for example, or a guaranteed minimum level of long-term incentives that will be granted. Basically fixed components of pay that are considered non-performance based that are contractually obligated to be paid by the employer to the employee. Kind of on the same lines are rich above market benefits or perquisites. Same thing, they're delivering more of a fixed value that's not necessarily performance based. Severance is another example. Severance practices over time have been on the decline, going down a bit. So some agreements have pay packages in excess of 3 times pay, for example, as a severance package, whereas the market's trending more towards 3 times or lower. Along with severance specific to change in control or tax gross-ups associated with severance payments. Golden parachutes sometimes are subject to excise taxation. A lot of agreements that are out there currently do have tax gross-up protection embedded in them, and this is a pretty hot issue that boards are struggling with right now because it's very expensive benefits, and again, it's not necessarily performance-based. Definitions of termination reasons, specifically for cause definitions and good reason resignation definitions. Oftentimes the language is loose, not very specific, so the severance payments are not necessarily highly correlated with the termination reason. And then finally, the term of the contract is another common issue. Automatic renewals have been very common. Shareholders are looking for more of a specified term, 3 to 5 years, for example. Reason being is because oftentimes the contract is put in place because there's uncertainty or risk associated with the job, especially a new hire, or there's some M&A activity or an IPO or some uncertain event. And oftentimes after a period of time, 3 or 5 years, for example, the uncertainty or the risk would go down, the relationship is improved between the executive and the board, and you know more about the organization and the upside and the downside, and so there may not necessarily be a need for a longer term contract, and you can use some of those vehicles we talked about earlier to provide similar protections.
So if boards are struggling with some of these problematic features that you just mentioned, what can they do?
So it's a good question. The simplest way, and a way we've seen to be fairly effective, is to have a conversation with the individual executive that's impacted by some of these provisions. Ideally, if there can be an agreement with the executive to voluntarily give up a certain feature because it's distracting to the board and to the company, and you just don't want to deal with the consequences, and chances are it may not be a significant issue for the individual. If, for example, it's a tax gross-up feature and the likelihood of a change in control is very low, it may not have a huge value to the individual, and it may just be a non-issue, and he can voluntarily give that up. That said, it doesn't always work that way.
Right.
So oftentimes there's a need to do some trading, give up one feature in exchange for some other type of feature. And the example I can think of is the 280G excise tax protection I was talking about earlier. So there's a few different ways you can take that sort of language out of a contract. One is to, and this is probably the preferred methodology, is since it's a contingent benefit, it's contingent upon being severed after a change in control event, to try to replace that type of benefit with another contingent benefit. For example, if severance isn't necessarily market competitive, maybe having a more market competitive severance package, or if the treatment of outstanding equity, unvested equity isn't necessarily market competitive, maybe you can change some of the treatment of that to provide some more lucrative benefits upon a severance event and take away the one that's really causing more of a concern to the board.
Is there anything else that you'd like to suggest to boards relative to implementing changes to existing contracts?
I think the advice I would have for boards is to take a look at the contracts that are in place, or even if they're not in place, and have a discussion around, are they truly necessary? Can you accomplish some of the same objectives that the using contracts is achieving through other vehicles, such as what we discussed before? And if possible, it might be a good shift in direction going forward. But if it's not possible and contracts are in place and there's legacy issues, try to limit any new contracts going forward to more of a fixed term, so there is a point in time where there's a reason to go back and renegotiate the terms, and you're not necessarily locked in time for a longer period of time with evergreen provisions. And also, another thing boards should do on an annual basis preferably is at least have an understanding of what the terms of the contracts are versus what are market competitive practices currently, as well as what are emerging market practices, just to understand what the terms are and if there's anything that may be a concern. Maybe there aren't any concerns, but it's better to be prepared in advance rather than after the auto renewal date or after the fixed term expires, and be prepared for whatever conversations needs to be had at that point.
Is the trend moving away from employment contracts?
I would say somewhat, yes, it is. A lot of organizations are trying not to put new contracts in, but they're dealing with their existing contracts separately. And one of the reasons for not putting in new contracts is they tend to be more contagious. So once a few executives have them, others see them disclosed and want some of the same benefits and protections that are in the contracts. So sometimes it's cleaner to draw the line and say, going forward, our policy is not to use contracts anymore, but to use more policies or offer letters or other different vehicles.
This is such a pertinent issue for board members, Bryan, so I really thank you for coming to share this information. It's definitely a hot topic right now, and we appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of the Board Governance Series.
Bryan Smith can be reached at bsmith@meridiancp.com. The Board Governance Series is a presentation of corporate board member and NYSE Euronext Company.